Hello, in this video we're going to be learning how to compare fractions to benchmarks. This is an introduction to a variety of different strategies for how we can compare two fractions to one another. So to begin with, we want to start by looking at what exactly is a benchmark. What does that actually mean? Let's take a look at a couple sample benchmarks together. One example of a benchmark is looking at how we can measure different lengths. We could say something is 3 feet long, 4 feet long, 5 feet long, but of course there's plenty of different lengths that are in between. Something could be, for example, 3 feet and 10 inches, which maybe would appear right over here. And we'd say that that could round up to being close to about 4 feet. We can say that's a little bit less than 4 feet. So again, we can compare it to that benchmark. It's a lot more than 3 feet, but it's a little bit less than 4 feet. We could look at lengths of time as another example of a benchmark. Something could be 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours long, but if it's 6 hours and 30 minutes, we know that that's right in the middle of 6 hours and 7 hours. So again, I can compare. It's more than 6 hours, that's one of my benchmarks. It's less than 7 hours, that's one of my benchmarks. It's right in between the two. I can use both benchmarks together. Another good example is looking at weights. If I buy something, I can say, like if I'm going to the deli counter at my supermarket and I want to get some cheese, let's say, or some turkey, whatever it is that you happen to be buying, you can say that maybe you want 1.5 pounds of something. And I can even write that right here. And I can use a fraction to help me. And I can tell that 1.5 pounds is right in between the benchmark of 1 pound and 2 pounds. Or we can look at it as measuring capacity. We're measuring cups here. And I can say that if I'm cooking a recipe, I can use 1/4 of a cup of something, half a cup of something, 3/4 of a cup or something, one whole cup. And this is a good example because this is really focusing in on the idea of fractions. And today, we're going to do an awful lot of work using the fraction of 1/2. So let's take a look at this right now. If I'm looking at the fraction 1/2, what I can do is think about, okay, what are some other fractions that are equivalent to 1/2? And in a previous lesson, you learned about how to identify some equivalent fractions. But as a review, I can say 1/2 is equivalent to, let's see, let me multiply it. If I do times 2 and times 2, I could say 1/2 is equivalent to 2/4. I could say 1/2, I know to find an equivalent fraction, I have to multiply my numerator and my denominator by the same thing. Let's multiply it this time by 3. And I can say, let's see, 1 times 3 is 3, 2 times 3 is 6. So that'll work for me for right now. All right, so I can continue to look through here. I can say 1/2 is equivalent to, let's look again, multiply my numerator and my denominator, and I'm going to come up with times 4. You can see my pattern here. I multiplied by 2 times 3, and I'm going to do times 4. 1 times 4 is 4. 2 times 4 equals 8. And I can go on and on and on to come up with more and more and more equivalent fractions. But I'll give you the list right down here. You can always copy this down, or better yet, you can make this list all by yourself. But we have 1/2, which is equivalent to 2/4, like we said right over here. It's equivalent to 3/6, as we found right here. It's equivalent to 4/8. It's equivalent to 5/10. I can continue going. It's equivalent to 6/12. I could go on and on. The number of fractions that are equivalent to 1/2 is endless. It is truly infinite. There is no end to the number of fractions that I could use for this. And that's an important thing for me to remember because I can find a way of kind of looking at this fraction to see how 1/2 looks. So let's click right over here. I can see here's my 1/2, one of these two parts. Here's 2/4, two of the 4 parts, and you'll see it's the exact same amount here. Here's 3/6, 1, 2, 3 out of 6. same halfway mark. 4/8, same idea. 5/10, same thing. 6/12, again, right here. We can almost draw a line going right up here to show all of these equivalent fractions. Something interesting I notice as I look at these fractions that I wrote that are all equivalent fractions, I notice that all of my denominators here, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and it goes on and on. What do you think? What do you notice about all of those denominators right there? You know what I notice? I notice that they are all even. They're all even numbers. And that's something interesting, but let's think, why couldn't I use an odd number as a denominator? Well, let's try and figure that out. Suppose I had a fraction like something out of, I don't know, 5. Well, if I take a look at this, 1 is half of 2. So it's half, equivalent to 1/2. 2/4, not only do we know that it's equivalent because of the math we did here, 2 is half of 4. 3 is half of 6. 8 divided by 2, cut in half is 4. 10 divided by 2, cut in half, that's 5. 5 is half of 10. 12 divided by 2, that's 6. 6 is half of 12. And yet, when I do 5 right here, I take a look and what's 5 divided by 2? 5 cut right in half. That's almost like 2.5. And that's kind of a weird way for me to write a fraction. In fact, if I go back to my fraction grid right here, here's my fifths. And if I look right in that halfway mark right there, sure enough, here's 1/5, 2/5, and it's like 2.5 gets me to that overall halfway point. That this is not a normal way for us to write fractions. And that's why when we look for equivalent fractions to 1/2, we stick with fractions with a denominator that's even because you can easily divide those in half equally. So let's start with that, but I'm going to tell you right now as a little preview, we're going to come back to this idea in a couple of minutes. Let's keep going though. So if we're trying to compare fractions to 1/2, let's get started. That's our focus today. And so let's start with the fraction of 5/8. And let's say that I'm trying to compare 5/8 to 1/2. This circle here, inside of it, I can write, for example, a greater than sign, or I could write a less than sign, or maybe I'm going to end up writing an equal sign. Let's do some math and let's figure out what the right answer is. So what I need to do is, gosh, I'm working in eighths and I'm working in halves, and that's hard for me to work with. What I need to do is I need to figure out how can I turn my half, my fraction of 1/2, into an equivalent fraction, but something that works with eighths. So another way I can think about that is what's a fraction equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 8? There are a couple ways that I can try to figure this out. One way that I could do this is to say what's half of 8? Because remember in our last page, we were saying that with our equivalent fractions, 1 is half of 2, 2 is half of 4, 3 is half of 6, 4 is half of 8, and so forth. First, I might just memorize what the fraction is from my table that I made before, but I can also say, what's half of 8? I know that that answer is 4. Another thing that I could do is I can start to draw my arrows to find equivalent fractions, and I can say 2 times 1. I know we're working with multiplication here. 2 times 1 equals 8. 2 times 4 is 8. What do you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. So 1 times 4, that's 4/8. So I know 1/2 is equivalent to 4/8. And when I go and I look at that and I compare that to 5/8, well, which is larger, 5/8 or 4/8? 5/8 is larger. So I know that 5/8 is greater than 4/8. Or I could read that as 5/8 is greater than 1/2. Let's try another example together. Let's try the fraction of, let's try the fraction of 3/10. So I'm going to compare 3/10 to 1/2. Okay, 3/10 compared to 1/2. Gosh, what's a fraction that's equivalent to 1/2 that has a denominator of, I'm working in tenths over here, that has a denominator of 10? What is half of 10? Half of 10 is 5. And by the way, you may just start to memorize these, and that's what a lot of us do. I know 1/2, 2/4, 6, 4/8, 5/10, 6/12. You just memorize those as equivalent fractions to 1/2. That's going to save you an awful lot of time moving forward. So I've got 3/10 compared to 5/10. Well, I know 3/10 is less than 5/10, so I can write the equation 3/10 is less than 1/2. Let's take a look at another example. Let's do 4/6 compared to 1/2. Why don't you pause this video right now and you try to solve it, and then we'll go over this problem together. All right, so let's take a look. I need a fraction that's equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 6, because that's what I'm working with here. I'm trying to compare it to sixths. I just know 3/6 is an equivalent fraction. I also know that 3 is half of 6. I know that 2 times 3 equals 6, so 1 times 3 equals 3. Well, if I compare the two, 4/6 definitely greater than 3/6. So 4/6 is greater than 1/2. Let's keep on going here. Let's try for this next one, 7/12. A little bit harder. We're working with a larger denominator. 7/12 compared to 7/12. Forgive me, I'm just going to sneak that in because I don't have an eraser for my marker. 7/12 compared to 1/2. Why don't you pause this recording right now and see if you can solve 7/12 compared to 1/2. All right, so I need a fraction that's equivalent to 1/2. I'm going to rewrite this maybe a little bit more neatly here. 1/2. There, a little bit more clear. All right, 7/12 compared to 1/2. What's a fraction equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 12? I could consult my list that I made earlier, or I could just think about what's half of 12, or I could go right back to my chart here and I can look for this halfway line here. Here we go, all the way down to 12, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6/12. Some ways that I could find 6/12. 7/12 I know is greater than 6/12. So 7/12 is greater than 1/2. Let's try one more example of this type. Let's say I had 4/8 that I wanted to compare to 1/2. Pause this and see if you can solve it right now. All right, so a fraction that's equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 8. I know that that's 4/8, but wait a minute. 4/8 and 4/8, they're the same fraction. Well, 4/8 isn't greater than 4/8. It's not less than 4/8. 4/8 is 4/8. So they are equivalent. They are equal. So I can write here 4/8 is equal to 1/2. Now we're going to switch things up a little bit. We're going to try things in a little bit of a different way. For this next set of problems, we're going to instead look at fractions that are using odd numbered denominators. So let's take a look right here and say that I'm working with 1/3. Now this is a little bit different because if I'm trying to compare 1/3 to 1/2 right now, I need to be able to figure this one out. I can't just say what's half of 1/3. Actually, or what's half of 3. I could, but let's take a look back at our chart. So here's my 1/3 right over here. And gosh, it looks like 1/3 and a half of another third. That's almost like 1 and 1/2 thirds. So let's take a look. Let's go back here. I'm going to set my equivalent fraction to 1/2 with a denominator of 3 is almost like 1 and 1/2. Now, again, I want to explain to you, this is not a normal way to write fractions. We would not normally express a fraction in this form. We'd come up with another way to represent this fraction that you'll learn about later on. But this can still help us because even though we know that this is not the normal way to write a fraction, I know that a fraction equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 3 is almost like 1.5 thirds. Well, 1/3 is a lot less than 1.5 thirds, a bit less, I should say. So it's less than. So even though I want to cover this up here for a minute because we do not want to express fractions this way. If we cheat and we do it just for just a moment, we can tell that 1/3 is less than 1/2. And of course, we can check our work over by going over here to say, yeah, here's my 1/3, here's my 1/2. Clearly, 1/3, which goes up to here, is less than my 1/2, which goes to there. Let's go on and try another example. Let's say I was doing 6/7. 6/7 compared to 1/2. Gosh, again, I'm dealing with some odd number denominators. Let me go and take a look right over here now, because I still need to find what a fraction is that's equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 7. This is going to be another one of these weird ones. It's always going to be a weird one when you're dealing with an odd number denominator. So let's take a look. Here are my sevenths down here. And if I follow my line, the halfway mark seems to be right around here. And sure enough, I've got 1/7, 2/7, 3/7. 4/7 would be over that halfway mark. So I've got 3/7 and almost like 3.5/7 would be equivalent to 1/2. So sure enough, I'm going to write that down. 3.5/7. And again, I'm gonna cover this up. This is too weird. We would not normally write a fraction, but we're going to do it just for now. We're going to peek because 3.5/7, that's a whole lot less than 6/7. We know that 6/7 is clearly greater than 3.5/7. So even though we would never write that fraction, it tells us that 6/7 is greater than 1/2. So this next one, I'm going to have you try. I want you to try and figure out what we can do to compare 2/5 to 1/2. Pause this video and see if you can solve and decide whether 2/5 is greater than 1/2, less than 1/2, or equivalent to 1/2. All right, so we need to find a fraction that's equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 5. Like I said, whenever we're working with an odd number denominator and we're just going to cut it into halves, it's going to be funky. We're not going to normally do it. Let's go and take a look right here. Here's my fifths. And sure enough, before that, I've got 1/5, 2/5. I almost want to say red fifth, blue fifth. No, 1/5, 2/5, 2.5/5. 2.5/5. Again, weird way of doing this. I'm covering this one up. But gosh, if I peek here for just 1 second to see so that I can compare the two, 2.5/5, it's just a teeny bit less than, 2/5 is just a teeny bit less than 2.5/5. But even a teeny bit counts. 2/5 is less than 2.5/5. So 2/5 is less than 1/2. Here's another one for you to try. Let's do 6/9. 6/9, comparing that to 1/2. I need to figure out a way to compare these two. Is it less than, is it greater than, or is it equal? Please pause this video, give it a try yourself. All right, so I need to figure out what's a fraction equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 9. And it's going to be another funky fraction here. Let's take a look at my ninths. We don't often work with ninths, but we can right here. Here's my halfway line going right down my chart. 1/9, 2/9, 3/9, 4/9. Oh, I'm getting really close to that halfway mark. 4/9, 5/9 is too much. It's almost halfway here. So it's almost like, gosh, 4.5/9 to that halfway mark. So I'm going to write that 4.5/9. I know it's weird. 4.5/9. Okay, I'm covering it up. We don't normally write fractions that way, but if I peek, 4.5/9, clearly 6/9 is greater than that. So since 6/9 is greater than 4.5/9, we know that 6/9 is greater than 1/2. So now we're going to switch things up. Now we're going to try and compare fractions to each other. So now we're going to use the skills that you had, and we're going to look to see, okay, how can we compare two different fractions? Let's try the fractions 5/6, and I'm going to try and compare that to the fraction 2/8. So I don't see a half here yet. I don't see anything that I'm comparing to, and that's okay. Hang in there for a moment, okay? So if I wanted to compare 5/6 to 1/2, well, I know a fraction equivalent to 1/2. I'm just going to kind of sneak it in right here. And a fraction equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 6, that's going to be 3/6. I know that 5/6 is greater than 3/6, so it's greater than 1/2. So I'm just going to put a little note here, and I'm going to say 5/6 is greater than 1/2. I'm just going to write it out there. And now I've got 2/8, and I'm going to do that same thing. What's a fraction equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 8? That's 4. 4/8. Okay. Well, 2/8 is less than 4/8, so 2/8 has to be less than half. So I'm going to write that down here. Less than half. Or I'm sorry, I was writing it as a fraction before. Less than half. Okay. Well, if this is greater than 1/2 and this is less than 1/2, I know that 5/6 has to be greater than 2/8. So I can put in my answer, I can say 5/6 is greater than 2/8. So for this next example, I'm going to have you try it. Let's do the fraction 3/10, and we're going to compare that to 2/4. Pause this video and see if you're able to solve these to compare to see which one is greater and which one is less. All right, so this time I'm going to rewrite it down here, maybe to keep it a little bit neater. It's all about what makes sense for you. I'm comparing 3/10 first to 1/2. So 1/2, gosh, if I want to express that as an equivalent fraction out of 10, common denominator here, let's see, 2 times 5 equals 10, 1 times 5 equals 5, 5/10. Well, 3/10 is less than 5/10. So 3/10 is less than 1/2, and I'm going to write that down here, less than half. You don't have to necessarily write that, but for me, that just makes a little bit more sense to see it written out, less than half. So now let's try 2/4. I've got 2/4, and I want to compare that to 1/2. And let's see, a fraction equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 4. Well, that's 2/4, and I had 2/4. I know that I'm talking about now their equivalent. So 2/4 is equivalent to half. Well, if 2/4 is half and 3/10 is less than half, it's pretty clear to me that 3/10 is less than 2/4. Let's try another example. Now, in this one, we're going to make it a little bit trickier for you, because this time we're going to have 7/10, and we're going to compare that to 2/16. sevenths. So now we're dealing with that odd numbered denominator, but we know exactly what to do. I'm not stressing. Pause this video and give this one a try. All right, so 7/10. If I want to compare this to 1/2, 7/10, and I want to compare that to 1/2 here. I need a fraction that's equivalent to 1/2, but with a denominator of 10. I know that that's 5/10. 7/10 is greater than 5/10, so 7/10 is greater than 1/2. But then if I switch and I come and I take a look right here, 2/7, let's try this one. 2/7 compared to 1/2. Okay, wow, here's one of these funky ones again. A fraction equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 7. Let's take a look. I need to know what half of 7 is. And that's 1, 2, 3.5. You might be able to just divide 7, and you might know that that's 3.5. Either way, 2.5 sevenths is less than 3.5. I'm sorry, 2/7 is less than 3.5 sevenths. So 2/7 is less than 1/2. So if 6 is greater than 1/2, I forgot to write that down before. If 7/10 is greater than half, and if 2/7 is less than half, then we know that 7/10 has to be greater than 2/7 because we're comparing each one to 1/2. I want to show you one final problem today. The last one I'm going to show you, and I'm going to tell you right off the bat, this is going to be an unusual one, and you're not going to be able to compare it necessarily. I'm warning you right from the beginning. Let's take a look at 2/6, and we're going to compare that to 4/10. Well, at first glance, it looks kind of easy. They're both even numbered denominators. It should be pretty straightforward for me to be able to compare them to 1/2. Let's do it. 2/6 compared to 1/2. Fraction equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 6. That's 3. 2/6. That's less than half. Less than 3/6. Less than half. I don't know what's so complicated about this one yet. Maybe you do, though. Let's try the next one here, 4/10. Okay. 4/10. If I go to compare that to 1/2, I need a fraction equivalent to 1/2 with a denominator of 10. That's 5/10. Okay. Well, 4/10 is less than 5/10, so it has to be less than 1/2. So this is less than half. We were able to do it up to here, but now here's where I get stuck. 2/6 is less than 1/2. 4/10 is less than 1/2. Does that mean the two of them are equivalent? Not necessarily. So how do we solve that? That's going to be for an upcoming lesson. Today, though, we were really just focusing on comparing fractions to benchmarks. We were using benchmarks of 1/2 and all of the equivalent fractions to 1/2. Stay tuned for that next step. I hope this was a helpful guide for you. Have a great day.